Okay, a lot of people that watch these videos is going to know Biz Owners Ed exists, but they don't know where we came from. This is where Biz Owners Ed came from. I'm going to get out of the way because these are two original founders, and they're going to tell you guys some stories right now. Take it away, guys.
Biz Owners Ed was a vision that I had, but was joined by several co-founders in making come to life. And the first co-founder and the one that led me through a lot of my business life was David Hammer, and he said I ought to open and tell you how we got acquainted. And it was quite interesting. A mutual friend of ours had suggested, I was looking for an attorney to handle the M&A aspect of selling a company that my wife and I started called Healthcare Staff Resources. And we did staffing of PTs, OTs, and pharmacists. And we brought OTs and PTs from other nations. We had, I think, 52 from the best PT school in the Philippines. But we put on the calendar 3 days or 3 years in advance when we wanted to sell it. And one of the things on the checklist was to find an M&A attorney. So when the mutual friend of David Hammer and myself suggested I speak with David, I called. We had a nice luncheon together, and at the end of the lunch I said, this guy is a nice guy, but I don't think he's right for what I want, and kind of checked him off and forgot him. Well, just a week or so later, I was helping 3 young men that wanted to start their own continuous forms printing company in Houston. And I had agreed to put an investment in and help them get it started. Well, I called the attorneys I had been working with, and the 3 of them were up from Houston on a Saturday. None of my attorneys that I'd been sending checks to along the way had time to come out to my office on a Saturday and help us. And I thought, well, hell, any damn attorney can do a start up and set up a sub S. And I remembered that I'd had lunch with David, so I called him, and David, unlike the rest of them, agreed to come out to my office on a Saturday and meet with us and get this company started. Well, when he got there, we probably weren't 20 minutes into our conversation when we were finishing each other's sentences, and I figured out I had made a real dumbass mistake. And that was in what year, David?
That was in March, or actually the meeting that you're referring to was actually in April of 1989.
1989. Well, David and I have been a team ever since, and we have been a very perfect team because we cover totally different sides of the effort, and it's gone very well. And was that where I was supposed to take you in this?
That's perfect. And I'm going to step backwards for a moment. At the initial meeting that we had, he said something in the course of that lunch that he's just repeated here that was very foreign to me. My background at that point had been representing New York Stock Exchange companies. 98% of everything that I'd done as an attorney for 10 years had been New York Stock Exchange company representation, securities laws, mergers and acquisitions. But at that time, I'd closed about 30 transactions, well, exactly 30 transactions for New York Stock Exchange listed companies. And what he said about putting the exit date on the bulletin board for everybody on the team to be reminded of on a daily basis was totally foreign to me, because I came out of an environment that is steeped in the laws of insider trading, where everything is a secret. And because everything is a secret due to insider trading laws, that is one of the one of the challenges that you have.
Answer the call.
Could be a deal.
No, this is why we're here, right here.
Go ahead.
That's one of
That would
the,
have been a fascinating call, I can tell you.
Answer the next one.
but that's one of the challenges of building a team in a public company environment, because so much of team building involves setting goals, and so much of setting goals in public companies is by definition somewhat of a secret because of insider trading rules. And so one of the first things that I learned about Jay, and I think everybody in this audience knows it well, is that even when he's not intending to, he's teaching principles of entrepreneurship. And the first thing I walked away from that lunch with was building teams, and how in order to build teams you have to be transparent with the information that's associated with your business. So that was the first thing that happened. The second thing that happened is he related about a month later, week later, whatever the time frame was, involved a call on Saturday morning. Now, when you represent New York Stock Exchange Company clients, they don't work on Saturday. Usually they leave on Friday, many times on the company plane, to do something exciting over the weekend. And so the notion of going and doing anything on Saturday was pretty foreign, but he invited me. I said yes. The rest of it was history. We succeeded in setting up this business for his three friends. Turned out to be a very profitable endeavor, both for the three friends and for the investor group. Worked out very nicely. But after that meeting in April, I never heard from him again. Now that was interesting, because when you represent public companies, there is something to do for that public company or companies every day, no exceptions. And so the whole notion of having a one-off experience with an entrepreneur was a very foreign environment for me. The next time that I have any communication at all with Jay Rodgers, I'm in Sweden on a Radio Shack transaction. And of course I'm 7 hours ahead of him in Sweden. And I walk into the hotel late at night after working on documents all day long, and there's a phone message from me at the desk, or for me at the desk. They wave me down and give me this phone message, and the phone message is Jay Rodgers called at 2:30 in the afternoon. Now, I still have the phone message. I reviewed it yesterday. So he called at 2:30 in the afternoon, and by this time, of course, it's 9, 10 o'clock at night in Stockholm. But I go up to the room and I call my wife. And I said, "You're the only person in the world that knows that I'm in Stockholm, Sweden, and I just got a message from Jay Rodgers." And she said, "Yes, he called here at 7:30 this morning, and I gave him your hotel location and your telephone number." Okay, that works fine. And so I called Jay next, and he says, "I have some people coming into my office tomorrow to take a look at the business that I told you that I wanted to sell. And I need a confidentiality agreement." Well, in order to understand what that undertaking was about, you need a little bit of historical framework. The only mobile phones in 1989 were attached to cars as power sources. Al Gore had not invented the internet yet, so there was no such thing as email. Computers were not on every desk. It was very unusual to encounter a computer in 1989. Now, it turned out, and he didn't know this, but it turned out that I had the Cadillac of the laptop computer industry in those days, courtesy of Radio Shack, which owned Grid Computer Corporation. And Grid had developed a laptop computer that Radio Shack had provided me with in order to do this transaction in Sweden. And so I have the required documents on my machine to produce the document that he wanted. But with that as the background, I said, "Jay, don't ask me how I'm going to do this, but this agreement that you need will be on your fax machine first thing tomorrow morning. And he said, good enough, and he hung up. Now, the second lesson, entrepreneurship again, is when you're delegating, give somebody both the authority and the responsibility. He didn't care how I did it. He was only interested in the end result. And so I produced this document on my Grid laptop computer that night. I go into the client the next morning, attach it to a printer, print it off, put it on the fax machine, and he has it. Now, don't hear from him again, which is kind of interesting. Now, a couple of 3 months later, he called up and said, I think this company that came to the office may be about to make an offer, and I would like to engage you to represent the company and our shareholders in conjunction with this sale. Will you send me an engagement letter? And I said, sure. And he said, one thing, I want a fixed fee. And I said, Jay, it's really difficult to estimate in advance what it's going to take in terms of hourly billings to close a transaction like this. It's very much a function of the buyer, and this buyer is a New York Stock Exchange listed client, and sometimes they make life a lot more complicated and detailed than you might expect in a transaction. I want a fixed fee. Well, it's going to be really difficult to do, and one of us is going to get hurt. I'm either going to make less money on this than I ought to, or you're going to pay too much. I want a fixed fee. And so I said, okay. And I pulled a number out of the air based on the experience that I had had with New York Stock Exchange companies, and I gave it to him. Now, the entrepreneurial principle that he was teaching me is basically this. Anytime you have an opportunity to choose certainty over uncertainty, choose certainty. He wanted the certainty associated with a particular fixed fee so that when he was talking to his investor group, he would be able to tell them precisely what this transaction was going to cost to conclude it. And then there was the negotiation. The buyer was represented by an old-line Boston law firm by the name of Warner and Stackpole. The attorney that we met with whenever we were ushered in his office wore a bow tie. So this gives you a sense of what this Boston law firm looks like. Very old, very staid, very predictable. The attorney wanted to get started with the transaction, and so he turns to page 1 and starts to go through it, and Jay interrupts him and says, where's Larry Stusser? Now, Larry Stusser is the businessman on the other side of the transaction for Lifetime Corporation. And the attorney said, well, he'll be along sometime later today. And Jay said, you know, I've always wanted to see Boston, and it's a really pretty day outside. This is the end of June in 1990 now. And so he gets up and leaves. And he's gone the rest of the day. Larry Stusser never shows up. Jay never comes back. And I've run into him in the hotel. We had dinner together scheduled for that night. And I said, what was that about? And he said, never negotiate against yourself. The businessman on the other side is not even here. And
If you're the only guy in the room that can make a commitment, get the hell out of the room.
And that's what he did. And miraculously enough, Larry Stusser shows up the next day. I need to take a step back because I forgot one of the really amusing aspects of the transaction. And this occurred during the days leading up to our getting on the plane to go to Boston. And I didn't know Jay at this time, but because I had been doing New York Stock Exchange company transactions, I had flown all over the world, either first class or in the company jet. And that was the way I traveled. That's not the way this entrepreneur did it, actually. If you know Jay very well, you know that he spends a lot of time looking for the most efficient way to buy things. So if you ever want to buy a car, you want to call him. If you ever want the best cell phone plan, you want to call him. If you ever want the best cable TV provider in days of yore, whenever we didn't stream and had cable TV, you call Jay, because he had always researched the best way to do all of those things. Another fundamental entrepreneurial principle: you make money on the buy, not on the sell. And he believes it, and he's always lived that way. And so when we're getting ready to get on the plane to go to Boston, he hands me my ticket. And this is, of course, pre-9/11, a little bit of a different world. And the ticket is made out to Mrs. Betty Rodgers. He had found a way to buy inexpensive tickets with a companion fare so that husband and wife travel together less expensively. And he instructed me very carefully in terms of how to hold my thumb over the name on the boarding pass whenever I presented it to the gate agent in order to get on. And so I'm standing there boarding the plane this way, and I'm thinking, I've fallen a long way in this world, because instead of flying first class or on the company jet, I'm flying as Mrs. Betty Rodgers. So that's how we got to Boston. It actually worked. I couldn't believe it. And Jay has some more extraordinary stories about airline travel that I'm hoping that he'll tell at another time, or maybe even today. I'm not sure what your schedule is. But as the negotiation proceeded in Boston, once Larry Stusser shows up, we get down to a particularly critical issue. The way this transaction was structured is as a stock buy. The buyer was buying all the shares of Healthcare Staff Resources, and the mode of payment was part cash and part shares of Lifetime Corporation. The shares as a percentage of the total enterprise value were rather significant. It was about 42% of the total consideration, but they were public company shares. In advance of the trip to Boston, I had done the research on Lifetime Corporation and saw that theirs was a very, very stable stock price. It traded about $35 a share, plus or minus a buck or two, and it had done that for years. So very stable investment grade security. So we get down to negotiating the number of shares, and Jay says, my shares have to be freely tradable. And they said, well, we can't do that. We've got to register these shares. Because if we give you shares that aren't registered, you can't trade them. And you're going to have to hold them under Rule 144 for at least a year before you can sell them. And Jay says, that doesn't work for me. You're going to have to register the shares. Well, we're not ready to register the shares until we have a deal with you. And Jay said, okay, you're going to have to contractually commit to me that you will register them within 30 days, and if the stock price of your shares falls between now and then, I get more shares to reflect the fact that your stock price has fallen. Well, you can imagine how that was received. And the room got a little bit louder and louder, and finally I said, can we have a moment? And the other side agreed, and he and I went out in the hall, and I said, you're screwing up the deal. This stock hadn't moved in years. It's $35 a share, always has been, always will be. I want freely tradable shares. So we go back into the room, and he gets a commitment on the part of the seller to register these shares and to increase the number of shares that we get if the stock price goes down between now and the time that they deliver freely tradable shares. We meet for dinner that night, and I said, why did you risk this deal for a seemingly meaningless point. And he said, I believe in control or liquidity. If you're going to take control of my investment, I need to be liquid whenever I want to be liquid, which means I have to have freely tradable shares. And if the stock price goes down, I shouldn't have to bear that risk between now and the point at which I'm liquid. Well, they agreed to it. No harm, no foul. We close on July 27th of 1990. On August the 5th of 1990, Iraq invades Kuwait, and the American stock market took a massive hit. And specifically, the value of the lifetime shares fell from $35 a share to $17.50. And by the time those shares were registered and delivered to him, he had doubled the number of shares that he had originally negotiated to receive in a transaction where the original negotiated number was 42% of the whole consideration. And so a really good deal became a really great deal because, again, he was teaching another fundamental principle of entrepreneurship, control or liquidity.
And maybe the tag end of that is I tell all the people that I mentor, when you go to the closing, you may have a earn out built into it, you may have stock built into it, you may have a note built into it. But if you follow the way I live, if the dollars you get at that closing table that day aren't enough to make you happy, don't do the deal.
And I'm going to say, these legends right here are from the 1900s. Did you hear that? Every story you just heard was from the 1900s.
And today, David has closed my last 14 M&A deals.
14. That was beautiful, guys.